Okay. Great. All right. So today we're talking about feminist theories. First, I want to start. How's everybody? Awesome. Wait.
Refresh. You're not in.
So today's feminist theories? Yes. Oh. Okay. It's going to be an interesting week. All right. So, when we say feminist theories, there is a huge range here. We're not going to be talking about just, there's no the feminist theory. So we're going to start with Marxist feminist theory, and this should be, I started with this partially because of the time period that this started, but also because we started with Marx, or pretty early with Marx. I guess we started with Durkheim, but so Marxist feminism should be fairly, it should make a lot of sense for people because, you know, we covered Marx. So they focus on the ties between women's oppression and capitalism, right? So just as you have a system in which the bourgeoisie are exploiting the proletariat, you have a system where men are exploiting women, right? They're seeing these direct ties. But also, all right, women's reproductive labor, and they don't mean having babies here. They mean labor in the private sphere. So reproductive labor are things like taking care of children, doing laundry, doing this sort of domestic work. That is unpaid, right? But they would argue just as much of a job and just as necessary for capitalism, right? Because if you think about it, our jobs are all-consuming. Especially think back when we had a system where a lot of women stayed at home, right? The whole way that men's work was set up was so the assumption that someone else was at home taking care of children. Someone else was taking care of them, right? Making their breakfast and all this. Think about historically how many men had their wives type their papers or edit their work, right? And that was unpaid, right? This was just something that women were facilitating men's work. This is unpaid, of course, and it's exploited. But it's a required part of the economy because we don't have an economic system where childcare is provided, right? It falls upon women often, or you can kind of now go out and hire someone to do this, but a lot of times if you can't afford that, it falls completely upon usually the woman. So looking at a patriarchal capitalist system where most women stay at home and most men work, this they saw as a form of almost slavery because women basically were completely dependent upon their male partners for everything. Their house, their food, right? They basically were in a situation where they worked for their husband and they were not compensated for that except for their room and board, basically. And if their husband was tired of them or whatever, they could be on the streets, right? They didn't have rights. They couldn't have their own bank account. Women couldn't, get a job, didn't have an education, right? And so basically they're completely dependent upon their husband, right? So they said there was a relationship between patriarchy and capitalism because if you have a system of inheritance, right, then suddenly you have concerns about paternity. Because if you're going to say children inherit what their father has, then suddenly it really matters who the father is, right? And if it matters who the father is, then women must be monogamous. Because we need to know that the man she's with is the father of her child. So then there becomes this fixation on virginity and sexual purity that does not go both ways, right? So men can have sex with whoever they want. Historically, it was not a big problem if a man was unfaithful to his wife, but it was a huge problem if a woman was unfaithful to her husband. And this is tied into this idea of capitalism, because if a man has an affair, it has no impact on inheritance, it has no impact on the economic system. But if a woman has an affair, then what if her child is not her husband's and yet he inherits his property?
And women
Right.
can make dubious when they cheat, so that's why.
Men can be devious when they cheat.
Not as much as women can.
All right, so this is what a Marxist feminist perspective is, right? This critique of women's position in society that is tied not just to gender, but to the economic system, to capitalism, right? So another perspective on gender is that of gender as performance. And this really comes out of symbolic interactionism and Erving Goffman. So very recently, right, we just talked about presentation of self, right, and dramaturgy. This is very much related to that. But instead of looking at presentation of self, it's about presentation of gender specifically. So there's this article, Doing Gender. This is by Weston Zimmerman in 1987. You don't necessarily have to know that. The reason I'm telling you that is that this article is such a big deal. And so if you do take gender next semester, I know Dr. Mazzaros is teaching gender, this might come up again. This argues gender is not something you are or something you have. This is something you do. So remember when we were talking about presentation of self, I said you wake up in the morning, you get dressed, the way you talk to people, the way you act is all based on you presenting yourself. It's the same way. The way you got dressed in the morning, you made gendered decisions, right? I don't see any men here wearing skirts or dresses, right? Because you are presenting yourself as male, right? And you also sit a certain way. You can imagine how men sit versus how women sit, right? Because from the time you're very little, if you're a girl, you're probably told, cross your legs, don't have your legs open. It's impolite, right? And so girls learn to sit a certain way, right? And so you can imagine a situation where you might be doing drag or something like that, and you might be trying to present yourself differently, right? And you might think about the different decisions that you would make to try to present yourself as a man or present yourself as a woman, right? A lot of this is unconscious. We don't think about these things. We learn these things when we're little, but by the time we're an adult, we don't think, oh, I'm sitting like a man or I'm sitting like a woman. It's just something that we kind of understand. So they argue that sex, which is genitalia, etc., right? Sex is the biological category, is different from sex category. That's assumed sex. When I talk to you, I don't know anything about your chromosomes. I don't know anything about anything like that, right? I am basing my assumption about your sex on how you're presenting yourself. So this assumed sex is different from gender, which is the performance of masculinity and femininity, right? All these things are connected but separate. So gender is accomplished through everyday interaction. So think Goffman, right? So I look at you and I'm going to interact with you based on your sex category and your gender presentation, and you're going to interact with me based on that, and I'm going to adjust my presentation to give off a certain impression. So think about, as a guy, when you're with the guys and you want to appear masculine, right? You might talk a little bit differently than when you're not as concerned about your masculinity, maybe when you're alone with your girlfriend, right? I know a lot of guys who feel a lot more comfortable talking about their feelings or letting their guard down with their girlfriend or a friend that's a woman than with their guy friends, because they feel like they have to put on a certain kind of pose with the other guys, right? So you can think about these different things, right? How you behave in different settings. We can't avoid doing gender. There's no way around it, right? And you're always doing gender. You might try not to. You might say, forget this gender thing. I'm going to dress gender neutral. Very difficult to do, right? Because a lot of times when we say gender neutral, what do we really mean?
Gender neutral.
Well, if a shirt is unisex, what is it really? It's for men, right? So it's very hard to try to say, I'm going to reject gender, because no matter what you do, you're thinking about gender. No matter what you do, you're putting out some sort of gender signal, even if you're trying not to, right? Because the first thing we notice about someone is we're trying to categorize them. Are they a man or a woman, right? And we interact with people differently if they're a man or a woman, right? We might not consciously think that, but we might talk a little bit differently to them, right? And if you've ever been in a situation where you can't tell if someone's a man or a woman, immediately you might be uncomfortable because you're thinking, oh, what's the social script here, right? So Judith Butler built upon this gender as performance issue. So she's really influential here, and you're going to be reading a little bit by her this week. So here's a quote from her. There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. So what does this mean? She says there's no essential gender. There's nothing essential about gender. There's no true womanness or true manness or anything like that. It's all a presentation. So she would say, she would go even further than Goffman and say there's no true self, for instance. It's just the stage. It's just the act. Right? I don't know if I agree with her, but there you go. That's what she would say. So she says that both sex and gender are socially constructed. And we can imagine what she means by sex is socially constructed, because if anybody's been in any other classes where they've talked about intersex conditions, right? So there is a lot of biological variation. Not everyone is born clearly male or clearly female. But our society says, no, sex is binary. So in that sense, sex is socially constructed, right? Because we have constructed this idea of essential maleness and femaleness that doesn't actually map onto natural categories. She says that there's no stable gender identity behind the performance of gender, that gender is constantly negotiated and created through performance, and that's influenced by culture. So the only thing behind the performance is whatever is socially constructed, right? Whatever society has decided means male and female, right? Or man and woman. It's all socially constructed. So she's like way post-structuralism out there with that. And let's see if I can get a video to come up. This is letting her explain it in her own words, because this, I'll admit, Judith Butler is a little tough to read. So hopefully I'm trying to cover her a little bit more today so that that helps you when you're reading her work. And of course, I'm sure I'll have an ad.
The video you're about to see is the most serious video Purple has ever created. Why? Because there's one thing we don't joke about, and that...
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting, our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. Now, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me, or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality, or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms.
So, one thing she's talking about here with the bullying is really interesting, because I think you can see this most clearly when we talk about masculinity, which is what I studied. Well, there's a reason why no men in this classroom are wearing a skirt or a dress, but many of the women in this classroom are wearing pants, right? It is much more socially acceptable for women to do things that are more masculine than for men to do things that are more feminine, right? And men from a very young age are often told not to cry, not to be a wimp, right? We kind of talked about this when we were talking about emotion work. Men are often having to keep their feelings inside of them. And one argument for why this is that femininity is devalued in our society. So for men to do something that is feminine is seen as them kind of taking a step down, right? Doing something that is, why would you do that? Like, it's bad. When women do something more masculine, it is more acceptable because what is masculine is considered celebrated. So if your little girl says, I want to be a scientist, we would say, good for you, right? Crush stereotypes, girl power, go into the STEM fields. If a boy wants to be a fashion designer, right, why would you want to do that? Like, no, that's not good work for you, whatever, right? So, and you can see this if you watch different videos of boys wanting to have more feminine Halloween costumes or whatever. But also, remember what I was talking about, with when a shirt is unisex, it's a man's shirt usually, right? Even gender-neutral clothing for babies is more boyish, right? Because the idea is it's okay to put your girl in something a little more boyish, but God forbid you put your boy in something a little more girly, right? And I've definitely noticed this with my son, right? That it is very difficult to get, our rule is no clothes that say things like, the chicks love me or anything like that. Because it is very sexualizing of a baby in our opinion. But,
That was when he goes older, when he's 15, 16, 17, he wears shirts all the girls wear shirts when he's older, it's not that.
Well, I mean, if he wants to, but the idea is that when you have a baby, if you put that shirt on them, they don't choose that shirt, right? So if they choose that shirt, if he chooses that shirt, whatever, but the clothes that we put our babies in communicates a lot about gender, right? About our expectations for them. If you put your child in a shirt that says wild thing and they're a little boy, we're saying it's okay to go out and, do what you want to do and be crazy. We don't put wild thing on little girls. We put sweet and, nice and snuggly and all these different things. So already we're giving our boys and our girls very different messages from a young age, right? Girls' clothing, it's not practical, My son has more pockets in his clothes than my wife does, right? Because we kind of say boys' clothes need to be practical, girls are there to be looked at, right? And so how does this, if we start our children on a gendered trajectory from birth, from before birth, I mean, have you seen gender reveal parties, right? And many of you are old enough to know gender reveal parties didn't exist like 10 years ago. Like, they just appeared one day. I don't know where they came from. They just appeared. But we're already saying from an ultrasound, we know one thing about the baby. We know its genital configuration, and we feel we're going to move forward and say we feel we know so much about that baby from that. And don't get me wrong, I wanted to know the sex of my baby, all right? Because I thought, well, I want to know what name we're going to give him and whatever. So it's not, I'm not over here saying you're wrong if you want to find out the sex of the baby or whatever. But I'm just trying to highlight that we put our children on a gendered trajectory from birth, from before birth even, right? And so there may be natural differences, but they certainly become highlighted, right? And so, you know, you have a boy, you put him in blue, you put him in the clothes that say Wild Thing, you tell him to stop crying, stop being such a mama's boy, that he has to dress up as a firefighter and not as a baby animal. You just do all that, and then you have an adult man, he's different from an adult woman, and you say, oh, it must be natural, right? Yeah, there are some natural differences, but think about how much we just created in the difference from birth to adulthood. So when we say things like women are naturally more emotional, right? Well, maybe there's a little bit of a difference, but also men have been taught from a very young age to hold their emotions in and not express them, right? And so she says that gender may also be challenged through performance. So she has a book, this book is Gender Trouble, that you'll be reading from. She also has a book, Undoing Gender, and talking about how to challenge gender. I found these great comics. I know you can't really see them. Yeah, I can't really see them from here, but this is Judith Butler explained through cats. So this cat says, reading Judith Butler hurts my brain. What on earth does performativity mean? Judith Butler says, I can help. Let me start from the beginning. See, there's no interior truth to gender identity because sex is always already gender. The cat says, you lost me at the beginning. Why is there no inner essence to gender identity? Judith Butler says, because gender is the result of repeated styles of the flesh that congeal over time. The process makes us think that there's a natural inner truth. The construction compels our belief in its necessity and naturalness. So it goes on and on. I thought this would be useful for you to go back and look at. So read the reading. Go look at it explained to cats because it's highlighting essential passages. All right. So this is on the PowerPoint. PowerPoint's posted online. If it's not already posted online, it will be. All right. So just take a look at this. It might be helpful, or it might just be funny. I don't know. Right. Okay. Now we're going to do a very, very brief overview of queer theory. Queer theory could have been its own section. I took a whole class in college called queer theory. So it's a very, very, very brief overview. And you're in women and gender studies. I'm sure they talk about queer theory, right? You've probably gotten a little bit. But I wanted to highlight two things. One is gender and sexuality are socially constructed. So Judith Butler's work is foundational for queer theory. But there's this challenge of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is the sense that heterosexuality is considered normal, it's assumed, and as Adrienne Rich discusses, it is actually compulsory. What does this mean? Well, remember I mentioned there's little shirts for little boys that say lady killer or whatever. Chicks love me. From a young age, we are assuming our child is heterosexual. And not only that, we're putting that on that child. We're basically telling the child, this is how things work. You will be attracted to women. When we joke that, oh, look, they're boyfriend and girlfriend when they're little babies, it's compulsory heterosexuality, where heterosexuality is not just assumed, but homosexuality doesn't even enter the equation, where a child might not even, you have to work through something to realize you're gay, right? So a lot of gay people will date someone of the opposite sex. Opposite sex is, now that we're talking about queer theory, kind of a problematic thing to say, but they'll date someone of different sex, in part because that's the assumption, right? So they have to figure out that they're not attracted to that person instead of, you know, because you've been raised to expect that you're going to be straight. Yeah.
I would say like also like before people are in the process of like having kids and stuff, like those people that are like, oh, if my kid comes out gay and stuff like that, they don't really have like taking kids on the way.
Yeah. So this assumption, right? Like, you know, how we talk about sexuality. So Adrienne Rich talked specifically about compulsory heterosexuality for women, because what she was interested in was how, so for men, it's like, don't be gay, right? Men trying to avoid being gay, and that is often tied to masculinity. For women, historically, being gay is not even something society thinks of to say not to do, right? So historically, for men, it was like a criminal offense to be gay, but it was like not even on the books for women. I mean, think about the Bible. The Bible doesn't say women should not lie with other women because it just does not occur to anybody, right? So she writes, there are not just mere taboos against homosexuality, but the enforcement of heterosexuality for women as a means of assuring male rights of physical, economic, and emotional access. One of the many means of enforcement is, of course, the rendering invisible of the lesbian possibility. So not even occurring to society to say being a lesbian is a possibility for women. Not something that there is even told not to do, right? And that this is enforced by the patriarchy in order to subordinate women, because she argues that if women realized that they didn't have to get married to men and be housewives, because think about, this was written in 1980, right? If women didn't realize that they had to do that, if they realized there were other opportunities, they wouldn't do it. That's her argument. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know, but she's saying, like, men are able to trap women into essentially a bad deal through compulsory heterosexuality. Another view, the social constructionist view of sexuality, is this idea that homosexuality is socially constructed. So historically, and he traces kind of the history of homosexuality, and what he says is when a man had sex with another man in like ancient Greece or in many of these other societies, it was not viewed as you're gay. It was just something you do. Sexual behavior was just something that people did. It was not tied to an identity. He argues that it wasn't until the 19th century that if you have sex with men, you're seen as gay. And that's something about you. And part of this had to do with enough men had to move from the rural areas to the cities where they met other men who regularly had sex with men. Because then it was like, oh, wait, there are other people like me. This is an identity. Right? So it took enough gay men getting into an area to say, wait, there's something here, instead of just being something that people did. And if you think about how homosexuality was viewed at this time, before that, if you had sex with another man, you're a man, because this is really talking about male homosexuality, right? They would say, maybe it was a situation you were in. If you think about situational homosexuality being a big thing, men have sex with other men in prison because they don't have access to women, or in boarding schools, teenage boys will have sex with each other, all sorts of different things where men might have sex with other men, but it is not, they would not think of themselves as gay, right? It would have been viewed the same way, right? Like in ancient Greece, it was viewed as there's a time in a man's life where he has sex with men, and then there's a time in a man's life where he has sex with women, right? When you're young, you have sex with men. Then you grow up and become mature and get married to women, right? So there was no idea that the type of sex you had anything to do with who you were, right? And that is something, so when we talk about the social construction of sexuality, we say, these categories that we view as being very natural were very different in the past. And that reveals how they're socially constructed, right? Sorry. So if Judith Butler in this unit represents this gender performativity perspective, Patricia Hill Collins represents this intersectional perspective. So Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And that's what really intersectionality is about. This is this idea that there are overlapping systems of privilege and oppression. So you are not just a man or just a woman. You are not just white or just black or whatever, right? You are a black man or a black woman or a white man or a white woman. You have, whether or not you're disabled, whether or not you come from a wealthy family or a poor family, all these things overlap and create unique systems for you, right? And it works for privilege and oppression, right? So one thing I look at is, for instance, well, I look at masculinity, right? That's kind of what I look at. So with overlapping systems of privilege, I look at like young, heterosexual white men, right? What does that unique position look like? I think a really common misconception about intersectionality is that it's the oppression Olympics, that you get points. And you add up all the points and you find out who's more oppressed or whatever. It's not what it's really looking at. What's really looking at is recognizing that we all occupy different social locations and that those social locations might be, that give you different outcomes, different life chances in different settings, right? So, for instance, and she's going to discuss this, but what are the overlapping oppressions for, or the unique situation of black men in a police situation versus white men, right? That's race is salient, but also gender, because there's something that we have constructed about black masculinity that's very different than blackness as a whole, right? There's a unique social position there. The experiences particularly of poor black men, because class can sort of have you be viewed differently, right? If you're dressed up in a suit and tie, you're going to be treated differently than if you're not, right? If you think about how disability plays out, if you are disabled and black, that's going to be a different situation. Or if you're black and gay or whatever, right? Looking at these overlapping systems. And this was a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. I've got a great video of her talking about how she came up with this idea, and it really illustrates the usefulness of it. And this is part of a longer talk. Actually,
many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping.
huh?
Yes,
Okay.
Creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraff and Reed was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real and fairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So, what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
Oh. Then she talks about other stuff. But you get the idea, right? This is, and I actually think a lot of times we talk about the usefulness of a different theory. This demonstrated the usefulness right there, right? Because it came from these legal cases, right? So how do we view maybe racialized misogyny, right, would be one way of putting it. I remember seeing something in a magazine a long time ago. It was talking about the experiences of women in the military. And it talked about how many members of the military are women, and it talked about how many members of the military were black. But it didn't talk about how many members of the military were black women, right? So ignoring that there's overlap there, and that their experiences are probably definitely different, because if you look at things like hairstyles in the military, there was a lot of controversy about black women not being able to wear different hairstyles in the military, right? Issues that black men probably would not face, and white women probably would not face, right? So this is great at getting at that. And this was brought to sociological theory by Patricia Hill Collins as a matrix of domination, right? Matrix being these, some sort of overlapping matrices sort of thing. And she talks in Black Feminist Thought about specifically Black feminism and the issues facing Black women in particular. As the video mentioned, this can be extended to all sorts of things, right? We can look at the experiences of Black gay men. We can look at the experiences of, disabled people with who are undocumented, right? Like, we can look at all different sorts of overlapping cases, but what we're going to be focusing on is specifically the experiences of Black women, because that's where this theory really came from. And I don't think it's in the piece that you'll be reading, but she has, in that book, she talks about the stereotypes that, what she refers to as controlling images that are given to Black women. Basically, that Black women in society are often put into these boxes, the boxes of being a mammy or a Jezebel, or I'm trying to remember the matriarch. Like, basically being told, you can be in our society, but we're going to put you in these different boxes. And it's hard to get out of those boxes, because that is how society views you. And so if you are outspoken, you're viewed as an angry Black woman. If you are dedicated to your family and taking care of your family, you're viewed as the matriarch who's too controlling and overbearing on her Black sons, right? So this idea that this is sort of these boxes that are given to Black women that are unique to not just being Black and not just being a woman, but being a Black woman, right? And she talks about, right, feminism historically, as it started out, the feminist movement excluded Black women, right? And it excluded lesbians. And so what does that mean for how, what issues were ignored, right? And if people know the history of even in the first wave of the feminist movement, even the suffragette movement, Ida B. Wells was sort of, they said, she was arguing with them because they wanted Black women to march separately, because they thought it would have it would anger segregationists if black and white women march together. So lots of different stuff there, right, to unpack when we talk about feminist theories. There's a lot here. We covered a lot. Any questions about these things as we move forward? Questions about anything here? Now remember, you had an extension on last week's assignment. Don't forget to do it. We have 2 assignments due this week if you didn't turn in last week's assignment. Right? Are you looking? Are you going? Yeah, so go check D2L, see if you turned it in, right? And so I'll see you on Wednesday. We'll be discussing, I think, Judith Butler.